Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be looking at the Seven of Wands. Um, my my slightly older, system of interpretation placed this card kind of around the King of Wands, which my new model still does. Um, especially the especially in a sort of active, dynamic way. Um, I see this as being the thing that the king character is choosing in between the with the choice being the Six of Wands and the Seven of Wands. And I see this generally as being a reflection of a social place, and a social place that isn't. It's not a place that involves large groups of people. That's more like the 4 and 5, in my opinion. 6 and 7 are still social, but I see them as representing small groups, small gatherings, or even just two people. So symbolizing, just relationships between friends, lovers, coworkers, family members, something like that. Wands being a suit that, I think in many ways symbolizes creativity in the way that organic growth can be considered to be creative. The way that, let's say, plants, wands, sticks, things like this. The way that plants grow branches, the kind of creative process that is at work there. It's adaptation, growth, expansion, reaching for something. Again, with plants, it would be reaching for sunlight and gases going up, reaching for water and nutrients going downwards. But within humans, also, I think there's often a sexual, social element to it, with obviously one of the most profound ways that human beings can be involved in the act of creating something, being, creating a life, right? And so the kind of sexual act and all the creativity that is involved with that. Now, in my newer model of interpretation, where I like to think of the pip cards as places, ideally both literal, real, physical places that can be, occupied physically, that you could go to, but also kind of like mental states that even if you can't go to the place, you could still maybe get an idea of the emotional theme, the nuance, just by envisioning yourself in this sort of place. And in that sense, this card really made me think of a karaoke parlor, karaoke club, KTV. It's got different names, but there's something about where this card lies in my newer model, sandwiched between an arcanum that in some ways deals with remembering and forgetting, and another arcanum that in some ways deals with mixing opposites, finding, not necessarily a middle path, but finding a nice oscillation between two extremes, as opposed to a blend, let's say. And there's one thing about karaoke parlors and the kind of social, creative energy that is associated with them that I felt like really resonated with me insofar as this card is concerned. There's something about the way that people take turns when doing karaoke, and this is I'm imagining this is like the karaoke parlor, as in you go somewhere, you rent a room, you and a couple of friends, you rent a room, and you have this room all to yourself. And so there's maybe four, five, six of you. Usually, if you've never been to one, it's usually a relatively dark room with some couches and a coffee table, maybe some weird, cool lighting, a TV, a couple microphones, and directories of some sort, either printed or on the TV that you could look up songs, and often some sort of remote or something to queue up the different songs you want to play. And so generally, I mean, I've been to karaoke, I wouldn't say a lot of times, but I've certainly been, enough times, and with enough different people to get a sense of what types of behavior are consistent, amongst different outings. What types of behaviors are maybe kind of unique to certain individuals? Because certain people will definitely have their own, ritual. Like, oh, every time we go to karaoke, we always do this or something. We only do duets or whatever. But for the most part, there's this interesting way that the whole activity sort of just orders the involvement of the individuals present. So one person does a song, they have the microphone. There's the video is playing that's got the lyrics printed on it, and the background music is playing, and they're doing the singing. And they generally stand somewhere closest to the TV or whatever the sort of spotlight area is. And then when their song is done, it's the next person's turn, and that person does their thing. And just that aspect of it alone is, in a lot of ways, really similar to the way just a normal, I don't know, healthy, good conversation goes. Especially in a group. One person says something. They don't talk for too long. They contribute. They try to get their point across. Then the next person comments. Then the next person. No individual tries to jump in and skip somebody else's turn. Everybody gives everyone else a chance to participate. But with conversations, unless we're talking about one of these therapy sessions where there's some sort of maybe you've seen this, often corporate retreats and activities will have this where there's some object, and like this is the speaking stick, and only whoever holds the speaking stick can talk, and then they pass it to the next person. And but generally in a regular conversation this is not the case, and things are still pretty, things play out pretty loosely. Some people do talk for way longer than others. Some people kind of just hang back and don't participate. One of the things that is much more standardized, like uniquely standardized in the karaoke experience, is that, first of all, generally, if you're there, you chose to go to karaoke, so you're familiar with it, you're comfortable with it, you're there to participate and take your turns. So you're not skipping turns, you're participating, and everyone is adhering to this, just circular. It's everybody gets a turn in order, and you keep going around and around. That kind of ordered participation, I think it's a pretty interesting blend of like that the chaotic sort of aspect of whoever's turn it is. The group doesn't know what they're gonna do. The group doesn't get to decide what song I sing. I get to decide. The group doesn't get to decide how I do it. Like, that's up to me. So every time it's somebody's turn, they have full control. But at the same time, the members of the group all subscribe to this collective control of passing this microphone around. It's one of the ways in which I find this to be a relatively unique experience, a relatively unique place where these unique experiences happen. And one of the other things is not just the difference between either being the person who is taking center stage, being the active participant, doing the singing, and everybody else. There is also this gradient that I've noticed. Mind you, I have gone to karaoke with just one other person, which certainly makes things a little different. But when there is a group of people, there's one person singing, the person that's going on after them, and often even the second person in line. So the two people after the person that's singing, they're often the most likely to ignore what is happening in the room because they're busy, picking their own song, queuing it up, figuring out what they're going to do. Whereas the people that have just gone are the most likely to participate in essentially being the audience to the performance of this individual, right? Again, I've seen a lot of different configurations of this, and the less people you have, the more likely it is that the person singing is essentially singing to a room of one or two people who have their faces buried in these catalog books deciding what they're going to do, and so they're kind of pretty much just singing to themselves, right? That is different. But with like 5-6 people, there's this interesting gradient of some of the people are actively participating, watching, clapping, singing along, cheering the singer on or whatever, and then individuals that are completely like internally absorbed, self-absorbed, and yet unlike in a conversation, which again, these kinds of dynamics often play themselves out in a conversation. Unlike in a conversation, these types of behaviors, these types of modalities of being, whatever you want to call it, they also rotate around. So each individual goes from being the performer, being the center of attention, to becoming then the audience member, to then becoming a person who kind of removes themselves and has to, decide what they're going to do next or whatever, to then once again becoming the performer, and it kind of going around and around like that. I think there's something interesting about that kind of oscillation of, that order, chaos, participation, being the active individual versus the receptive individual, going around and around. One of the other sort of places or scenarios that I thought of that this also tends to happen in sometimes, though not, I guess, to as far of an extent, is game nights. But then it really depends on the game, because there even though most games have turns that sort of pass the attention and the activity from player to player, from participant to participant, there are certain types of games that effectively put people on stage. The kind of games that, for instance, often involve teams working together, trying to communicate with each other through charades or drawings or something like that, to try and so like your teammate, they have to communicate a code word or something to you without saying it. Those types of games, very different from, let's say, something like playing Monopoly or Game of Life or something like that, even though turns exist in all these examples. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to bring up this as an environment and as an activity as something to contemplate, to meditate on, as just like as a way of being. The last thing I'll say is almost like with psychedelic drugs, obviously not to as intensive an extent. It's just karaoke after all. But I've noticed with psychedelic drugs, there's like an afterglow that lingers on after the experience, where even though the individual is no longer under the effect of the psychedelic drugs, they still nonetheless retain some of that point of view. They remember, what it was like to see the world through those eyes. And so even though they don't quite see things that way anymore, they could still nonetheless kind of work under some of the presumptions, beliefs that were being made at the time. There's an interesting lingering effect that I've noticed with karaoke, where after a karaoke session, and I haven't seen this every single time, but the majority of times, after a karaoke session, people for a little bit of time, they hold on to that kind of turn-based, I'm not even sure how to describe it, but like I just remember leaving the karaoke parlor and people still behaving in this fashion where everyone in the group would essentially let one person shine, do their thing, be the star of the show, and then that person would voluntarily give up their spot and pass it along to the next person, and the next person would sort of do it, and then that wears off after a little while. But it certainly makes the hanging out, the conversations, the social interactions afterwards pretty damn enjoyable, pretty different, pretty unique. Of course, with the opposite being that kind of hangout where people are just kind of waiting for their turn to talk. They're not even listening. They're just like waiting for you to finish what you're saying so they can say whatever they felt like saying. But there's none of the the half of the equation that involves enthusiasm, an enthusiastic kind of audience-like participation in the other individual is missing. But yeah, I think some interesting stuff to think about, and certainly if you have the opportunity with things kind of opening back up in a lot of places right now, karaoke is out there. If you've never tried it, I mean, I would certainly recommend it. It's I know that it could also be, I used to be pretty terrified of it. I still I think have only done it once in like in a bar, because sometimes bars at nightclubs will have a karaoke night. I'm still kind of too shy to do that. I've done it once, maybe twice, with some with considerable quantities of liquid courage having had been involved. But the private rooms, small group of friends, besides just being a really fun, enjoyable experience, I certainly think it's an interesting experience. It's an interesting social experience. It's really fascinating how often without very much or any explicit agreement as to what the rules of conduct will be, everyone just seems to behave accordingly to, everyone just, I guess, presumes these are the rules, and they generally seem to work. It's interesting to think about. But I'm going to wrap things up here. Thanks for watching. Drop me a like if you enjoyed the video. Feel free to comment free reading for your chance to win a free one-on-one reading. I'll be back tomorrow with another video. Talk to you then. Take care.